Ryan Day looks like the best head coach in college football, and he has two Einstein-level coordinators in Chip Kelly as the offensive coordinator and play caller, and Jim Knowles as the defensive coordinator and play caller. And those three guys, Ryan Day is the head coach, Chip Kelly is the OC, Jim Knowles is the DC, who I would tag as the best OC, DC, and head coach combo in all of college football, look like they are commanding the best team in the sport. The most stable, well-rounded, perhaps, dare I say, the most physical team in the sport. A team that can shoot itself in the foot several times and still win by 28 points over a defense that is among college football's elite, and a team in Iowa who I think is top 20, top 25, and has one of their best teams in a while under head coach Kirk Ferentz. Ohio State survived a Week 6 in college football that tried its best to commit arson in every college football stadium. Upsets happening left and right. And teams that the media stuffed, the same media that questioned whether Ryan Day was a top 10 head coach, that the media stuffed like a Thanksgiving turkey with unwarranted hype, even some teams that I happen to fall for, and many other intelligent analysts happen to fall for, well, they fell, often on their own sword or down a flight of stairs on Saturday. And Ohio State prevailed. They shut Iowa out. They didn't shut out Iowa, because Iowa did score a late garbage time touchdown from Caleb Johnson, but Ohio State shut Iowa out. And what I mean by that is Iowa, for the entire game, had minimal to no chance of opening the door to having a path to victory. Ohio State 35, Iowa 7. Ohio State 412 total yards, Iowa 226. Ohio State had 2 turnovers, Iowa had 3. 21 first downs for the Buckeyes, 10 for the Hawkeyes. Ohio State had a 10-minute plus possession advantage, held Cade McNamara to under 100 yards passing, held Caleb Johnson to minimal gains, completely neutered him for the majority of the game. I don't know if the college football world is ready for the Big Ten to win back-to-back national championships, but I can tell you that I certainly am. And before we get into this game and analyze Iowa and Ohio State and the prospective futures of both of these teams, what we have seen through 5 games from the Hawkeyes, the Buckeyes, and how it relates to the Big Ten and college football as a whole, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Comment your reaction to this game and your reaction to the whole slate of college football's Week 6 games. Also, like the video, give us a thumbs up. Share this video around to other college football fans who care about the sport like we do, who are invested in it 24/7, who start watching games at noon and stop watching games after midnight. And again, comment your thoughts and your reaction down below. Check out our Patreon page and our Discord server and our merchandise store via the links in the description down below in the pinned comment if you want to support the channel. And the Discord server is free, and I emphasize out of all those things that you join the Discord server, there are dedicated Iowa and Ohio State football threads where we will have deep conversation about those teams. There are dedicated conversational threads, in fact, to all 18 Big Ten teams. So please join the Discord server. It's totally free, again, via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. And like, share, subscribe, hit the bell. All of those things help you out, and they also help this channel out. But yeah, Ohio State, they shut Iowa out. They shut them down. And this was a Hawkeye team who I think is top 25, top 20 caliber, maybe even top 15 with how down this year of college football is. Iowa with 2 losses is not going to be ranked in anyone's top 25 outside of maybe my own, and I'm still trying to figure out the top 25 as is, because with all the upsets, the entire perspective of the sport has been thrown into a wood chipper. Like a body thrown into the wood chipper, and coming out of it's all the blood and guts and just grossness. It's not fun. You look at the AP top 25 right now, there are 5 teams that are tied. Not all for the same spot, but Iowa State and Notre Dame are tied for 11th, and Indiana, Oklahoma, and Kansas State are tied for 18th. This is chaos. This is the most chaotic year in college football since 2007. And 2021 was a pretty chaotic season too, but we're already elevating past that. We are. And I would like you to take a look at all of the top 10 teams who played yesterday and watch those games, look at the box score, the deep analytics, and outside of Texas, because Texas has a legitimate case, tell me which of those teams you think can be better than Ohio State. Can. Not is, because they aren't. The only team that may be better than Ohio State right now is Texas. Which of those teams in the top 10 can be better than Ohio State? Both yesterday's top 10 and today's top 10. Because I got to tell you something, there are not many teams who can be. Not many. Maybe, but this is a stretch in my opinion, maybe Oregon. Maybe Penn State. I don't think that's as much of a stretch, but Ohio State's better right now. Maybe Georgia. Maybe Alabama. Maybe, but again, I think it's a stretch, Miami. And then obviously Texas. That's it. And two of those being stretches, the others being strong maybes, and Ohio State being unblemished in record, unlike all of those teams, except for Oregon, Penn State, Texas, and Miami. I think it's clear that this is one of the best teams in college football. And in my mind, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, this is college football's best team. You see that. In Ohio State, they averaged 6.3 yards per play on an Iowa defense that is elite. They averaged 0.53 points per play on an elite Iowa defense, an Iowa defense that held them to 7 points in the first half, that forced 2 turnovers, that neutered Ohio State's passing offense for the majority of the first half. And in that second half, they came out, they struck, they were sharp, they were well coordinated, well coached. Some of the play calling issues that I think were showing of some hubris in the first half were dealt away with. And when you have a second half team that is as elite as Ohio State is in general, you're blessed. And you have one of the best coaching staffs in all of the country. Iowa, I think, has a pretty good coaching staff. It's certainly better than last season's because Tim Lester is a massive upgrade over Brian Ferentz. And you saw that in this game, where Iowa was trying to get as many yards as they could through the air, keep Ohio State's defense honest. They weren't extremely successful, but they were able to get into Ohio State territory on a lot of their drives in the first half. They averaged 4.7 yards per play, which I would say is pretty impressive from Iowa against this Ohio State defense. The problem is they only averaged 0.135 points per play. They missed a field goal in the first half. I think they were a little bit too conservative for wanting to win this football game in the first half as well, and you just can't do that against Ohio State. And I understand that Iowa probably doesn't have the offense to win a game on the road against Ohio State in the horseshoe, but it is what it is. You got to play to win. You have to. And again, in a week where Alabama lost to Vanderbilt, where Washington beat Michigan, where Texas A&M blew out Missouri, it was 34-0 at one point. SMU beat Louisville, where Tennessee lost to Arkansas. It's just so bad. Where USC lost to Minnesota, where Miami nearly went to the bathroom on themselves against California, who's not all that good. And there were other games that were intriguing and where teams looked problematic. Ohio State shot themselves in the foot multiple times in the first half, came out flawless in the second half, they dominated, and they won. And you see that in these statistics that I'm showing you. This was also a game where Iowa, I think, played to their A-level game. They played very close to their ceiling. I don't think Iowa was doing all that bad of a job blocking on the offensive line. Their defensive line was playing hard. Their linebackers, especially Jay Higgins, were playing like All-Americans. Their secondary did not allow many deep passes. That whole talk about how Ohio State is just going to blow out Iowa because they'll fling it to Igbuka and Smith because of the issues that Iowa's secondary has been having. That happened maybe once or twice. It was rather the systemic, calculated, well-coached, and well-executed performance of Ohio State's staff and players, where they were able to do what Iowa wanted them to do on offense and yet still bully Iowa's defense. Iowa wants you to drive down and take 5, 6, 7 yards per play, but then force you into mistakes or field goals in their own territory. Well, Ohio State did exactly that, the first part of what I said, but they still scored several touchdowns when they got into the red zone. They did not make any mistakes outside of that first half. They turned it over twice, but then Ohio State's defense forced 3 turnovers, winning the turnover battle. Iowa only had 1 penalty. 1. But Ohio State only had 1 penalty as well. A false start for Iowa and a hold for Ohio State. It was a well-disciplined effort in regards to penalties by both teams. And as for Ohio State, outside of that first half, it was a well-disciplined effort all around. And as for Iowa, it was that way for all 4 quarters. And they were nowhere close to beating this Ohio State team and to competing with them after halftime. That doesn't mean Ohio State was perfect, but outside of those 2 turnovers that Ohio State produced and what I thought was a pretty dumb play call with a Will Howard power run on 4th and 2, where if you just hand it off to Judkins there, that's an easy conversion. Play calling was damn near perfect. Execution was pretty good, and it was clear who the better team was, and that was the Ohio State Buckeyes. But let's quickly give some takeaways for Iowa here, and then we'll get to the Buckeyes. Iowa's offense is not awful, but it is certainly bad. They improved. I think Tim Lester is doing his job. This is a much better offense than where it was last year, but they're not even top 50. And even a top 50 offense would struggle to score double digits on this Ohio State defense. That's how good they are. This defense in Ohio State, the Silver Bullets, are too elite to move. It's the same thing as Georgia's defenses in 21 and 22, as Michigan's in 23 and 22, as Alabama's in 2011, in 2017, really in the whole 2010s with Nick Saban and Kirby Smart. Same thing as Iowa's the previous 3 years, 4 years, because I think this year's defense is also going to be very good. Same thing with Penn State's defense last year. This is an elite unit. Only elite offenses, maybe near elite offenses, if they can find a few mismatches, are going to be able to move this defense. And that's not Iowa. Now, in regards to Iowa's offense moving forward, they can win Iowa games against many teams on the remainder of their schedule. You look at Washington next week, then Michigan State, then Northwestern, then Wisconsin, then UCLA, then a bye week, then Maryland and Nebraska. And I'll dive into the schedule in a few seconds here in detail, like the weeks these games are played, home or away, maybe even some matchups. But none of those teams have the same caliber of offense or especially caliber of defense outside of maybe Nebraska with how good that defense looked against Rutgers compared to the Buckeyes. None of those teams. Ohio State is by a mile the best team Iowa has and will play all season long. Period. Point blank. End of conversation. There is no shame in Iowa losing in the fashion that they did. Some will say, well, they got shut out nearly 35-0 and scored a garbage time touchdown. It was 7-0 at halftime. And there were people on Twitter screaming that Ohio State needed to fire someone because, well, they're not beating Iowa by a bajillion points. And if I were an Ohio State fan, I would have felt the same way, because if Michigan was only beating Iowa 7-0 at the half, I would be mad too. I would be furious. But as for an Iowa fan, I would say this is your best team since 2020, 2019, and because of Kirk Ferentz keeping his son on as long as he could, I think you wasted several years of elite defenses, and we'll see if they can just reload on defense next year or how long Kirk Ferentz is going to stay around. But you just got to be better offensively. And the change was made too late for Iowa to have a chance in games like this. I mean, if they played on the road against Penn State or Oregon this year, do you think they have a chance at winning those games? No. No, they don't. They averaged 5.2 yards per pass attempt in this game, 4.3 yards per carry. And those numbers are inflated by late in the fourth quarter when they scored a point on that long Caleb Johnson run. Caleb Johnson had 27 carries for 116 yards and a touchdown. And I look at this and I think that it's not good enough to beat Ohio State. It isn't. It wouldn't have been good enough to beat Michigan or Ohio State or Penn State last year. So it's not going to execute at a high enough level this year to win a game like this. Caleb Johnson was Iowa's entire rushing offense. I mean, on the day they ran for 116 total yards. Caleb Johnson attributed 86 of those yards on 15 carries and a touchdown, but Cade McNamara just had sack yardage. Brennan Sullivan had that one long run, and Kamari Moulton and Jason Patterson didn't do anything. It was truly Luke Lachey, Cade McNamara, occasionally Reese Vanderzee, who Davison Igbinosun just bullied, and Caleb Johnson. That was Iowa's offense right there. And that's not good enough against an Ohio State defense that has 11 elite players. All of their starting players are elite. Now, before we move on to Ohio State, the question is, can they make it to Indy? And I would say they can. Washington and Nebraska are their toughest remaining games, and I would say Nebraska is, by a significant margin, the best team on their schedule remaining. I don't think Washington, Michigan State, Northwestern, Wisconsin, UCLA, or Maryland are top 25 teams. Nebraska may not even be a top 25 team. And you look at Iowa right now, where they're 26th in FPI, 29th in S&P+, they're 81st in offensive efficiency and 8th in defensive efficiency, and you have to think that because they've played 3-3 Minnesota, undefeated Iowa State, undefeated Ohio State, that they may be underrated. There may be a negative bias against Iowa in the metrics because they have played a tough strength of schedule. They just have. They played a team who could be top 10, probably top 15, top 20 in Iowa State in the out-of-conference. Minnesota is not great, probably not good, but average above average, yes. And not every team, particularly in the Big 12 or ACC, can say they've played even a team at Minnesota's caliber, which is pretty sad. And then obviously Ohio State, top 2 team in all of college football. In my mind, the best team in college football right now. And they played them on the road. They played Minnesota on the road. You look at these numbers, I think that Iowa is a top 25 team, maybe even top 20. Their offense was a little more disappointing than I thought it was going to show. They disappointed me in this game, but Ohio State's defense is that good. And against Washington, who they play at noon this Saturday, week 7, they play Michigan State on the road in week 8, Northwestern at home in week 9, Wisconsin, or maybe Northwestern's neutral field, but I do think it is at home. Wisconsin in week 10, UCLA in week 11. There's a bye in week 12. Week 13 is on the road at Maryland. Week 14 is hosting Nebraska Friday night at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 6:30 p.m. Central Time. All of those teams are not even close to Ohio State. And when you look at offense or defense, none of those teams are close to Ohio State in offense. Potentially only the Cornhuskers are close to Ohio State on defense. So for Iowa, they're going to be scoring more points against all of the teams remaining on their schedule, and they will be holding probably all of their remaining opponents to not just under 35 points, but probably under 28 points, maybe all of them under 21 points as well. This is a good team. They can make it to Indy. They probably need some balls to bounce their way, but they can make it. There's still a path. And they're, with all the chaos that's going on, if they win out, they can maybe still reach the playoff, but they're not going to do much in the playoff. You look at Ohio State, meanwhile, and I think it's obvious that this is college football's number 1 team. This is the best team in the land. The win over Iowa, I think, is just as or nearly as impressive as Texas's win over Michigan. Now, Texas played a better first half. Texas toned it down in the second half, while Ohio State revved it up. And Texas didn't shoot themselves in the foot whatsoever. However, it has become abundantly clear to me in watching Iowa and also watching Michigan play that Iowa has a way better defense than Michigan does, and Iowa has a more balanced offense. So take from that what you will in reference to the fact that Ohio State might beat Michigan by 30 or more points, and also in the fact that, well, Iowa's probably a better team than Michigan. And the fact that Ohio State shot themselves in the foot and still won by 28, really by 35, against an amazing Iowa defense and an overall good Iowa team, I think says something. I think that this was an impressive win. I thought that Ohio State here would win 30-17. That was my prediction, that it would be competitive for really 3 quarters, and then Ohio State would pull away in the fourth. And by pull away, I didn't mean pull away as in win by 20 points, and it was never in doubt that Ohio State was going to win this game. What I meant by my 30-17 prediction is that in parts of this game, there were going to be Ohio State fans who thought that Iowa was going to come out on top, because I thought that their rushing offense was going to push around Ohio State's front in some cases, and that McNamara and his receivers and tight ends would be able to keep the defense honest enough to move them a bit, and that Ohio State would have to pull out most of their cards and show most of their potential to win, because I thought Iowa was that good and that Ohio State wasn't the best team in college football. Well, I was wrong. I think that they are the best team in college football, and if they're not, they're right up there with Texas, and I'd say Ohio State and Texas right now are the only teams who are clearly objectively elite in college football. You know, elite teams don't lose to Vanderbilt. Elite teams don't lose to Northern Illinois. Elite teams aren't down 28-0. Rarely, at least, in all of those instances. Elite teams don't pull away from Boise State using 2 special teams touchdowns at home. Elite teams don't get in dogfights with Bowling Green and struggle to score points on UCLA. I know Nick Singleton was injured. I could go on and on and on. Now, some of those teams I do think are actually elite or near elite or close, but this is a down year in college football. It is down, and while that is mostly subjective, I think seeing the amount of chaos, looking at FPI and all of these different ratings and watching the games tells us that there is at least more parity than there has been. And I would also say that there isn't the same quality of depth on most teams. There just isn't, except for Ohio State and Texas. And maybe a little bit of Penn State. But I want to save that for, well, when the time's appropriate. Ohio State is second in FPI and S&P Plus. Per ESPN's FPI, they're also the most efficient team in college football. I think the only reason that FPI doesn't rate Ohio State above Texas is because Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning were 5 stars, and Will Howard was a 3-star, if that. And it's a known that ESPN's FPI specifically treats quarterbacks, even with their recruiting rankings, almost more seriously than perhaps they should be taken. Like, quarterback is a massive component, if not the biggest component, of ESPN's FPI. And I partially get it, because quarterback's the most important position in the sport. But I will tell you that Ohio State's weakest position on the team is quarterback, and it probably won't matter. I don't think it'll matter one bit. The offensive line looks really good. The defensive line does. The defense and offense are just masterful, both in how they're crafted and how they execute. In my opinion, this team looks like 2022 Georgia. And being number 1 in ESPN's FPI in efficiency means that Ohio State right now is on track to being the best team in football. Efficiency is the biggest tell. Efficiency is basically how are you performing this season relative to everyone else. which is basically a power rating without taking in priors or without taking in recruiting rankings. It's just looking at the body of work and not caring about much else. That's really what efficiency is. That's why Indiana is top 10 in efficiency and second in the Big Ten in that category. Because when you don't factor in recruiting rankings and other things, they do look like one of the best teams in college football. But we just don't know yet because of their history. They haven't really played much of anyone, but I think they're good. Ohio State isn't just good. I think that they are on a caliber of the national champions of the 4-team playoff era, which I don't think many teams this year are. I don't know if Texas is. I don't know if Ohio State is, but I feel like they could be. Same with Texas. No other team outside of those two I don't feel like is at that caliber. I said to friends of mine last week when I had Alabama ranked as number 1 that I wouldn't pick that Alabama team to beat any of the national champions of the 4-team playoff era. Like, I wouldn't pick that Alabama team to beat 2014 Ohio State, 15 Alabama, 16 Clemson, 17 Bama, 18 Clemson, 19 LSU, 20 Bama, 21 and 22 Georgia, and 23 Michigan. I would have picked all of them to beat that Alabama team, probably by 10 points or more. This Ohio State team, I'm not going to go out and say that I would pick them to beat any of those teams yet, because I do think this is a down year, but I look at this team and how it's built, and again, in my mind, they look like 2022 Georgia. They look that good. They look like a Georgia-Michigan team of the previous 3 seasons that can win it all and that can dominate everyone on their schedule, potentially, or at least game control them. They're very impressive. They're well coached, and I think that Ryan Day is one of the best, if not the best head coach in college football right now. And you look at this offensive line. This is going to be the last thing I'll say before we get on out of here. This offensive line is elite. They were pushing around Iowa's defensive front all day long. And they were doing it in basic and also complicated ways, whether they were bringing over an offensive guard or tackle or blocker. They were blocking downfield. They were physical, whether G. Scott was helping out or any of the tight ends, the wide receivers. And it wasn't just Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson, like I felt like it was in the first 4 games. In the first 4 games, it felt like at times the offensive line was a little bit shaky, and it was just the raw athleticism of the backs that were taking care of opposing defenses that were way too slow and lacked physicality and talent to stop them. That's not what this game was at all. There were a few times that Judkins or Henderson broke through tackles or evaded through guys, but not all that often. More often it was the fact that Ohio State was scheming 5, 6 times 7 or more guys to block downfield for these running backs or the quarterback, and they outcoached Iowa in that regard. They also out-physicaled Iowa. I do think that this offensive line is elite. It's certainly a top 10 unit. Maybe elite is stretching it, but they had an elite performance against Iowa, their toughest competition by a mile all season long. And to prove that, they only allowed 1 sack, 2 TFLs, and they had 40 carries for 203 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. They averaged over 5 yards per carry on a fantastic Iowa defense, only allowed 1 sack and 2 TFLs from that unit. And as for Will Howard throwing a dumb pick, nearly throwing another, and sometimes not looking polished or even good at all in the passing offense, well, that wasn't on the offensive line at all. He had a lot of time. That was just on him, and the fact that Iowa is good at taking away the football, and they're good in coverage. And I think that they were an undervalued defense entering this game because, well, they gave up a few fluky plays through the air. But this offensive line for Ohio State, I know, is a great unit and could be elite, could be near elite. And I think that combined with having the nation's #1 receiver core, the nation's best running back room, a few underrated tight ends, a quarterback who fits the scheme well, and a genius offensive coordinator, this offense is going to be hard to stop, even for the best defenses in college football and the best teams in college football. My MVP for this game is wide receiver Emeka Egbuka. He had 9 receptions for 71 yards, 3 touchdowns, several contested catches, didn't matter. He has good hands, good football IQ, And he's really having a big bounce back season from last year where he was injured and the offense was, as we know, poorly managed and poorly coached. So congratulations to Emeka Egbuka, and also shout out to Jeremiah Smith for having another one-handed catch for a touchdown. He's just unreal. We're blessed to have him and Ryan Williams in this sport as young players. Final thing I'll say is Ohio State is fun to watch. This game was fun to watch at the ending because in the first 4 games and last year, watching Ohio State was annoying because it felt like the only reason they won some of their games was a recruiting and athlete edge. It felt like they were getting away with not being physically tough and not being well conditioned and just letting their athletes ball. This was not that at all. They were well coached, they were physical, and they also showed off their athleticism. And that earns my respect. I think they're the best team in college football. Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Kind of Little OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Kind of Little Ismar, Tyler Nye, and Chilton Cush for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being all-conference members. Make sure to check out the Patreon page, merchandise store, and Discord server via the links in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Have a great day, guys. Go Hawkeyes, and go Buckeyes.